Welcome to Artificiality, the podcast by Helen and Dave Edwards from Sonder Studio. We created Sonder Studio to empower humans in our complex age of machines and data. Our research-based, design-oriented consulting and education services help you and your organization work better with machines and data. You can learn more about us at getsonder.com. We've heard a lot about how generative AI may negatively impact careers in design, but we wonder, how might generative AI have a positive impact on designers? How might generative AI be used as a tool that helps designers rather than as a replacement for designers? How might we use generative AI in design education? How do design educators and their students feel about generative AI? How else might generative AI help designers in ways that we haven't uncovered yet? To answer these questions, we talked with Juan Noguera about his individual design work, his teaching at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and about his recent article in The Conversation entitled DALL-E 2 and Midjourney Can Be a Boon for Industrial Designers. Juan proposes that AI image generation programs can be a fantastic way to improve the design process. Juan's story about using generative AI working with bronze artisans in Guatemala is particularly compelling. Juan Noguera is an assistant professor of industrial design at the Rochester Institute of Technology. A Guatemalan, he was raised in a colorful and vivid culture. He quickly developed an interest in how things were made, tearing everything he owned apart and putting it back together, often with a few leftover pieces. We enjoyed talking with Juan about his teaching, about his student projects, and about ideas he has for how AI might be able to help designers more in the future. Thank you very much for joining us. We're really excited to talk with you today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
We found you through the article in The Conversation and thought it was really fascinating reading about your process and thinking about how to use generative AI in industrial design. Could you perhaps go back and tell us what inspired you to write that article? Where did that come from?
So it was maybe about a year back in time that I started hearing a little bit more chatter about generative AIs, coming to the mainstream. I know that it's been, being developed and sort of bubbling up, but it wasn't until last summer that I started hearing some colleagues talk about image generators and how that was going to, affect things. And I actually have a friend from university who actually works at a startup that was involved in generative AI. And got to talking with him over the summer and did a little bit of brainstorming about it. And it just stuck in my mind what was going to happen. I started getting beta access to some of these image generators in the summer of 22. And I just heard this avalanche of negativity about it coming from the design world and like concern and worry. And I started seeing people's reactions and how people just started being afraid of it, right? And it coincided with me thinking about democratization of things and technology, and I've actually written about it a little bit in the past. And I started to say, well, this is something that seems inevitable. I need to look into it. How can I actually work with it? Can I get something positive and productive out of using generative AI in a process, and how to do that responsibly? Because that it's a complicated conversation. There's a lot of ethics conversations around it that are very interesting and relevant, and all of these points of view seem valid, right? And it just made me want to start working with it and discover what that is. Because as an educator, I'm a college professor. I feel like in the future we're going to have to teach students how to properly use generative AI. And it just felt irresponsible not to try to explore it. I've been exploring it in my work, trying to write a few papers and things that nobody's going to read, right, in journals and things like that. But after talking to people at The Conversation, it was something that needed to be done for me to actually try to put it out into the world, like in a simple way. This is how it could affect this particular industry, right? Because it's going to affect many industries, and we all have to deal with it and try to understand and digest this information.
Well, the article your writing does a really nice job of sort of stepping through how you took it was iterative, but it was very much you were applying your own creative judgment at each point. And I'm curious about how did that feel to go backwards and forwards between you and the AI? I mean, the final result, the volcano and the images. I could just imagine the images from Guatemala being so sort of evocative and inspiring in their own sense.
For me, honestly, it was very natural, and it was a workflow that didn't feel completely alien to me. It didn't feel strange because typically a designer will go to their sketchbook, which is like within arm's reach at all times, and we will use it as this sort of reflection pool of ideas where I put something down, I think about it, I come back to it, and if I'm feeling uninspired, I'll go and take a walk, go to the museum, an art museum, look at other people's work. I'll be on the internet, I'll be reading, I'll be absorbing information, and then I'll use that to create. And that's something that designers do day in and day out. No work is 100% original because we're just being influenced by everything we see and experience and the things we use every day. And our preconceptions as to, like, if we're designing a chair, what does a chair feel like, look like? We have these notions because of objects that already exist. So for me, using generative AI, this felt exactly the same way. It just felt like it was accelerated. It just felt like I was able to feed myself with more information faster that I wasn't necessarily literally using in my work, because that often isn't the case. Like sometimes I'll go take a walk and see a beautiful sculpture or fountain downtown, and that'll spark an idea for some reason, right? So sometimes just seeing all these AI generated images of things that were unexpected or sometimes even illogical to an extent might spark something new. So that's a process that was already happening for me, and it just became an extension of that. I started seeing it as just another tool to help me accelerate the process.
What was the term you used the other day? The serendipity surface.
Yes.
Increases the things that you would otherwise not have run across, that become a little bit random, a little bit of noise in the system, allowing you to find something else, some other concept and some other connection that you otherwise wouldn't have made.
Exactly. And it becomes very specific to everything that you want to see. Like if I'm designing, a chair, maybe I would go to a museum where I would see furniture. But if I'm designing, let's say, a plywood chair, I can go into the AI and just generate 10,000 plywood chairs. It's almost like getting access to the plywood chair museum, right? I'll be able to see all of them, digest all this information, and then create my own.
Do you find anything different about your part of the journey? So you could open up a book that's about chairs, and flip through pictures of chairs, of every chair that's ever been developed, and designed in the past. But these are not actual chairs, that when you're asking it for plywood chairs, and at least systems will get better over time, but at least at the moment, sometimes you get a chair that you look at it and you go, I'm not sure I think that's going to fall over, right? Like there's a lot of things that are like not necessarily, they're not real chairs. But do you find anything different in your experience looking for inspiration between seeing something that's actually, there and exists, whether it's the basic chair you have as your table or the sort of iconic Eames chair, or versus things that are completely made up? A chair that looks like an avocado is one of the ones that always pops up on the front page of DALL-E, right?
Yes.
Is there anything different there in terms of the way you read it and you feel it and you get inspired? So
the generative AI will do its best to create for you, no matter what the prompt is, no matter if it's illogical. It's going to create, even if it fails. Like it's not going to say no. It's not going to disqualify the idea or the prompt. It's just going to try and do it and give you a result. I always tell my students, don't be afraid to jot down or sketch down ideas, even if they seem dumb at the time, because you might come back to an interesting detail that you sketched out in this form that you might find interesting or beautiful. And you might stop your hand and say, no, I'm not going to sketch this idea down because it's a bad idea. It's dumb, right? And we do this a lot. So I tell my students not to do that. I tell them to just generate a quantity of things, put them down on paper, then they can come back and use all of that information to refine their objects. With AI, you just get that. You get the good ideas, you get the bad ideas, you get the things that defy logic or gravity. They're still there for you to see, but you'll start to see little glimpses of, like, this is an interesting material combination I wouldn't have tried, right? Or I like this form. It's not really at all relevant, but I like this form. I have a student who is actually an image that I show in the conversation article of a student of mine, Jaden, who designed an electric violin. And actually, Jaden was looking for violin shapes in Midjourney and wasn't really getting anything that he thought was useful. And then he saw this sort of glitchy shape on the corner of an image, and that just caught his eye. And he said, "Wow, that's a really interesting shape, and let me just run with this," and just generated an entire project just inspired by this thing that wasn't even the actual object that the AI was showing him. So that unexpected encounter is what happens a lot with these AI generated images.
If you fast forward a little bit and think about that, there will someday be a system that takes, the input of, design an electric violin and comes out with a complete design, right? Completely accurate, ready to be fed into a 3D printer. How do you think about that in terms of being both a designer but also as a teacher? So as you're thinking about, helping your students like Jaden find inspiration and then them going forward to actually completing the end design, where's that handoff that you're looking for, that somebody's only is using it as inspiration but not to complete the design? Or is that maybe the wrong question even to be asking? Like, is that what we're trying to do, is to find a break point? Or how do you sort of look into the future that way?
So industrial design and other disciplines find themselves in an interesting position where the product of these generative AI systems is not an object yet, right? It's just these images. You see a lot of conflict with disciplines where the final product, for example, someone who is an illustrator, is an image. And then there's this big debate about how AI was trained on the work of many, many, many illustrators and is able to generate these images based on that knowledge. So in a sense, it's remixing everything that we've created, right? That's what the generative AI systems are going to do. If these systems become more sophisticated, and they will, and eventually start generating a 3D object that can be made, I think at this point it's going to be doing the same thing, which is just perpetuating the same objects over and over, remixing them, and really taking that product directly can stifle innovation. So that's something where being able to use it and to teach it responsibly, I think, becomes important, because we must recognize its power. We must recognize all the things we can do with it and how we can just accelerate and enhance the work that we do, or that anybody does in any industry. But know that the human element is what is going to drive things forward and push them forward, right? So we should really take advantage of it and not just let it drive.
How is it... How's your experience of this, including with your students, changed or refined how you think about grading or assessing creativity or picking up on sort of laziness or shortcuts? How do you think about that whole sort of testing regime?
In a very visual workflow that we have in the classroom with me, I would say it's all about honesty in what's happening. If you are doing a round of ideation, you're using AI to boost it, and you're bringing those 300 images with you, and showing, I generated all this work. I started picking out this, I like this and that, and you make that a part of your evidence in your process, and because then you took that work and you created a new thing. being honest about that process, I think, is very important, and knowing that, letting students know that it's okay to use these systems as long as we are transparent in how we use them. I know there's giant debate, and I work at a university, and everybody's just going nuts about, can we even ask people to write a paper nowadays, right? Or is it just going to come from a generative system? And that is honestly a problem. Right. In our case, being in a different industry, I think we can approach it a little differently and be a little less afraid, because our students that's not the main thing they work on. They do some writing, right? But it's not the main thing we do. Letting them know that it's okay to use it, but this is how you do it, is very important, which was why I'm trying to reach out to more colleagues through my writing and through my work to push that conversation forward, because I've only seen lots of negativity and fear from it, and it's not something that is there is a precedent. Like if you look back to, let's say, the invention of computer-aided design systems, CAD systems, and people back then were just drafting on a big table and drawing, right? And people who were very good at that lost their job when computer systems came and just introduced CAD systems. But in general, the design discipline got boosted by the ability to access these tools. Like eventually, as everybody adopted them, it just became an integral part of how we work, and it makes things 100 times faster. I also think the same way about the internet. Like the internet happened really gradually, happened over like a couple of decades. But if I didn't have access to the internet yesterday and I have it today, and I all of a sudden can access image search and find anything in the world, I would feel the same way about the internet as I feel right now about generative AI.
How do your students feel about it once they've tried all of this? Does their perspective shift on it? And what sort of questions do they start asking that they didn't ask before?
Actually, my students are perhaps the most excited about this, or like very positive about its existence, and I actually share more of that point of view with them. They do see it as a tool, and I do think they see it as software and something that's very helpful, and something that's just going to help them boost their capabilities. So I have seen lots of positivity in the classroom, and people actually use it on their own organically. Not even my students that have taken my class. I've just seen it in general at my university. Students start incorporating it into their process in an honest way to say, I just made this part of my sketching and ideation process, and it just helped me get to somewhere unexpected, which is what we're looking for a lot of the time. Just finding maybe something that we wouldn't have thought of because we're just stuck in our preconceptions of what things should be, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe disciplines like industrial design are like well poised to take advantage of generative AI as it exists right now. And of course, things will change, and maybe our points of view will change, and how much we're excited about it might change as well over time. But I mean, there's like really interesting historical precedent for this. Like you said, the Industrial Revolution, there's a bunch of interesting examples. One that I thought was particularly interesting was looking back at the invention of the sewing machine. And when Elias Howe invented it, it was actually the first few prototypes worked really well. Like the first few sewing machines ever made just worked perfectly fine. But it took decades for it to be adopted. Right, the resistance to its existence was like very high, and people who were in the trade of creating clothes by hand, who were tailors, just were extremely resistant to using this machine that they saw as something that's going to replace them. Really over time we learned that what it did is actually just take away that part of the craft, which was just creating a good hand stitch, and liberating people's mind so that they can be more creative in the clothing design, right? And that little nugget is what interests me. So are we just getting help with something that was mechanically difficult, like just generating hundreds of sketches to get ideas from them? And just making that faster and better so that then we can just spend more time actually using our critical thinking, which I think is the valuable skill that we have. And I already, even before generative AI, have seen some of the core skills of design kind of disappear. Like being able to use CAD drawing systems and actually make 3D models was something that took people many years to master just like a decade ago. And nowadays, the latest CAD systems are so great that you can teach somebody how to use it in 1 or 2 weeks. And they're creating models and they're 3D printing stuff, and it's just accelerated, right? So that skill is no longer something, hyper important that we need to focus lots of time on. It's something that people pick up of YouTube in a few days, right? Now we get to spend more time in the classroom and later on at work, just doing the important work, which is actually to create things that people will actually use, that fit their lives better, that are more responsible to manufacture, that are more sustainable, use better materials. Like we have to spend time on those big problems as opposed to trying to spend lots of time drafting like some blueprints on paper.
That's such a good explanation, and the early research is showing that these systems are that the same things are happening with coding. That the expert coders are more time. They're in flow more. They're tackling more complex problems. They're thinking more about the way their code has to be used by others. All of those kinds of things that they didn't necessarily have time for. Which, puts us back into sort of the optimistic side. So, we don't necessarily have a bias one way or the other. We're just really fascinated by how, what's actually happening in the real world. And I do love those early, we've looked at these systems over the last few years before they were based on these foundational models, but more in the Autodesk generative AI work and architecture, and the prevailing view of being able to get across a lot of different combinations really fast and then apply judgment, or being able to get the machine to do calculations that otherwise wouldn't have been possible, to reduce materials or reduce manufacturing cost. Those kinds of processes seem pretty standard in a lot of areas now, and are now just part of that design process.
I'm curious if you've thought about other opportunities to use AI, whether it's generative or not, in the rest of your workflow. I mean, I'm thinking about with the new release of GPT-4, you can feed an image into it and get a description out of it. You have a workflow. You talked about how you created guitar designs that can be used it can be produced in a 3D printer, right? Where are there places in the overall workflow, like we focused here so far on the sort of the inspiration end of it, but have you thought about where else in your overall workflow that having essentially a prediction machine that can accelerate through those predictions and put more emphasis on your human judgment and critical thinking? Are there other places in there that you'd like to see something helping you?
Yes, actually, there's a couple of places where I've been trying to incorporate it a bit more. One of them is we tend to do a lot of storyboarding to try to, and we do this very fast with other designers and other parts of like a design team, where we try to see objects in use, and we do that by quickly generating images. That's something that now can be done in seconds, right? We describe a scene essentially and get an image and drop that in and are able to like craft an interesting sort of disparate but like fun storyboard from it very quickly. So that sort of teamwork, that let me describe this idea, but instead of trying to, wave my hands in the air like I'm, playing Pictionary or something, trying to describe an object, I'll just generate it for you. Here it is in a second, and you can continue that conversation. That's been useful. The other is actually working with people that fabricate things, and namely artisans. I've lately been working on a project working with artisans back in my home country in Guatemala, where my team is trying to work with people who do bronze, have a bronze foundry. So we're trying to describe pieces that we're trying to create. Instead of just showing people a sketch, we're not able to actually have a conversation with like bronze sculpture images where I describe a bronze sculpture that I'm trying to create with the artisan, and I get an approximation. And that starts a conversation with the artisan who doesn't really get my sketch on paper as much as they get a picture of a bronze thing, because they understand that language perfectly well. And we're able to go back and forth and actually have the artisan go and use the AI themselves and like input things that they'd like to see, or they'd like me to see, to get my opinion. So we go back and forth by actually using one of these systems. So as a communication tool, it's also being fantastic.
And have you found the ability to have multiple people iterating? So you're handing it over to somebody else who's then changing some of the prompts or isolating a part of the image and focusing in, and that's already starting to work. I mean, the systems aren't really necessarily designed for that at the moment, but I'm fascinated that you're able to use it that way.
Yes, we're actually being able to, with this group of artisans, share a DALL-E account. And I'm like, let's look at this one we created. Let's create a bunch of variations. Let's delete this part. Let's see what else we can get if we change this part of the object with, this other decorative item. And we sometimes get the result that we want. We sometimes get something different. But regardless, it always creates conversation, and it's made the workflow very interesting. Whereas before there was a different power dynamic where, I was the designer, had an artisan who was going to make something for me. And that's kind of where it ended. I was supposed to hand down something done so that the artisan could craft it for me. It's now more of a conversation, and it's going to make things way more interesting. It's going to level that relationship in a very positive way.
That's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because when you read about kind of where people are thinking collective intelligence will go, but the collective intelligence of groups of humans will go when machines are part of it. One of the biggest opportunities that Nesta, which is a group out of the UK that sort of follows, and it's kind of the thought leader in this space. One of the big things that they highlight is the need to improve communication in groups of humans in such a way that they're truly co-creating, that you take out this power dynamic. And you just described the sort of quintessential way of doing it. I hadn't actually thought about the image systems as being so potent in that. But now that you say it, it's kind of obvious. I just had in my mind that it would be, some sort of nudge from an AI that says, hey, don't interrupt so much or something. And you kind of exploded that with this idea that, well, just the images are enough to translate an idea from someone's mind to somebody else's mind when they actually have a completely different mental model about what it is even that you're talking about. And the power of doing that with images as opposed to with text, I think is a phenomenal example.
Yeah, in my discipline, it's in the past it depended on my ability to sketch something on paper. Like if I was very good and showed you this object that I've sketched, you might understand it fully. But also your ability to respond to me, where we depend on your ability to sketch and show it back to me. Or we try to describe things like, again, with our hands in space, right? And that's difficult communication. It's often what happens when you are trying to transfer an object design to someone, especially an artisan who might not have technical training. Like they know all about their craft. They might not be a designer who knows how to use a CAD software. And I think this just blows that out the window. Now we can just both I have literally been logged onto a video call, logged onto the same sort of Discord channel as somebody who's like using the AI with me, and we're just like talking and typing things in and having a conversation back and forth, and then we eventually settle on an interesting idea and make it. So it's really equalized that, and I think it's going to enrich those relationships really well. And it also works really well at a distance.
I do love I also really love your idea about storyboarding. We do a lot of storyboarding as well, whether it's, storyboarding how it changed to a complex human system where you have to move, think about how people interact with each other, all the way down to storyboarding about, an actual digital interface for a product. And your storyboards are always limited in terms of the amount of time and energy that you have and your sketching ability. And we try to work through a design process where we're bringing lots of non-designers into the process, right? You need to bring people in who are actually going to be users. And they're always the last ones that want to pick up a pen. The ability to generate images, however, that actually communicate what you really want to and make it a little bit more, realistic, is fascinating. I mean, you run into the challenge that, it becomes, you lose that imaginative leap that everybody takes between a sketch and the real thing. So the viewer could become bonded with that color palette that happens to happen, or that button, shape, or, the shape of the guitar that that's behind you on the wall. People could look at the generated image and then suddenly they're fixated on that one thing when that wasn't what you really wanted them to look at. So there's this amazing power of sketch being still, leaving a lot open to the imagination. But that's still also possible to actually design a system that actually does that well, that actually allows the image to be a little bit not technically fuzzy, but imaginatively fuzzy, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I actually think some of the earlier iterations of particularly, let's say, Midjourney, where right now it's getting very good. I think when it wasn't that good, it also gave more interesting conversation to my work groups, because we got to saw something and we're like, oh, that's interesting. Can we get another view of that? And the answer was no, we can't. That's all we have, that image. We can regenerate it, but it's never going to be the same. We can't literally ask the system for, oh, can I see the backside of that, please? Right? So that we get that little spark, and then we go from that, and that's been great. I think maybe as these systems get much better and they turn into a conversation, maybe some of that will go away, because I'll be able to actually ask for more specific things like, oh, I really love this object. Can you create, 10 different sizes of it? Can you show me the backside of it? Can you output a 3D file for me of this? I want to take a look. That might change how I feel about this, because I do think the key there is to let it spark creativity. If we're not doing that, then we are going to just go into this echo chamber of just getting the same results over and over again, packaged in different ways. And that might, if anything scares me, it's that sort of monotony.
It's actually a wonderful sort of product design challenge for, those at Autodesk and Adobe, and they're kind of the two that I think of most, to pursue an opportunity to enable and accelerate the design process, but not make it so that we limit the end creativity and critical thinking that the human mind puts on it, right? If you say, design me this and show me, make it truly CAD accurate so I can go ahead and print it, and give me a video that shows the thing rolling down the street that's now my marketing video, like all of a sudden, like the whole thing's done. The object has been designed. It can now be manufactured. You've got your marketing campaign with the slogans. Like, you can see how generative AI can actually do a lot of those things. So how do you create the tools that allow for all of some, or maybe even all of that, but still encourage the human creativity in the process?
I think starting by recognizing that, especially in the world of design, a lot of what's out in the world is not good design. Like, we have to start by recognizing that. So we are getting a lot of not good design mixed into our AI generated results. And we have a lot of irresponsible design out there, things that are just using tons of material, using the wrong kind of material, things that can't be recycled, that can't be reused. Like, we are flooded with these objects. It's a big problem. And it's something that is like in the foreground of my students' thinking, going into the world as professionals. Like, they don't want to be the generators of just more plastic junk. Like, I think that's great, especially this generation that's now going into the workforce. Designers, they're way more responsible and thoughtful. And I'm really hopeful about that. And we do have to be aware of, right now, we're getting a lot of regurgitation of things that are irresponsible and badly designed. And we should just use it to an extent, because we cannot rely on those systems yet to make those decisions responsibly.
You want to be able to turn to it and say, design me a thing, and then, okay, and now put in another prompt that says, okay, make it more sustainable. And see if it can actually be smart enough to actually regenerate the image in a way that will be more sustainable. I mean, it's theoretically possible, right, to at least have a machine that can understand these things, but somebody actually needs to design it that way.
Yeah, but there's not a lot of data out of there about how to make things out of mushrooms.
No.
Yet, you know?
Fantastic.
Although I do have a student that was generating lots of products out of mycelium, out of AI. That was an interesting process as well.
I'll roll on that with one final question for you. As a teacher, you see all kinds of emerging, interesting talent and ideas. Do you have any student projects that you want to share as like great celebrations of cool new things that's going on in your classrooms?
Absolutely. Some of the first explorations that I did with my students are actually linked in the conversation article that I published. So there's a link in there to this very long read, but it's actually something that my students wrote about their experience. So if anybody wants to go in and read directly from them what they thought about using it, there's some good and some not so good thoughts and points of view about it. I saw people that used it and then got inspired by it and then literally used nothing of what they got in the process. They saw it and they're like, oh, that made me think of something else, and just design something completely original, different from what they got. It just led them, just moved their thinking, just nudged their thinking. There's other people that were more literal about their use and said, oh, I'm designing a camping stove. I like this shape right here. I'm going to incorporate that into the door. Oh, I love this handle here. I'm going to incorporate that into the stove. And actually just created a whole new thing out of just little bits of information that they got from the AI. So I've let my students be the judge of how they could best use it and put it in their workflow. And I've gotten different results. I just did this course for the first time last fall semester. I haven't been working with this for very long because it's not been available for very long. But so far, the result has been positive, and I am hopeful that at least in our profession, it's going to be a positive tool that we should embrace. It's not going away, and I have a lot of colleagues that don't like that it exists, but it's not going away. So we might as well deal with it, find ways to use it responsibly, find workflows that work well, and share those with others. And I think that's just going to be a net positive for our industry.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. This has been great fun. It's got my mind thinking of all kinds of things.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe on Substack or your favorite podcast platform. And please leave a positive rating or comment. Sharing your positive feedback helps us reach more people and connect them with the world's great minds. Seriously, a review on Apple Podcasts is a big deal. And if you like how we think, then contact us about our speaking and workshops and human-centered product design. You can learn more about us at getsonder.com, and you can contact us at hello@getsonder.com. You can learn more about making better decisions in our book, Make Better Decisions: How to Improve Your Decision-Making in the Digital Age. The book is an essential guide to practicing the cognitive skills needed for making better decisions in the age of data, algorithms, and AI. Please check it out at mbd.zone, on Amazon, bookshop.org, or place an order through your favorite local bookstore.